Okay, so this is the 2021 version. It's a presentation that should not be news to many of you, in that I'm going through the presentation that I would use if I also had new trainees in the room. Now, if you're like ourselves, the COVID situation has made it difficult to entertain the idea of training new course rating volunteers because it would be difficult for them to work one-on-one in a mentoring situation with a senior course rater, given the restrictions that we have. So it is, however, I think useful. It's been a while since we've done much course rating, and I think a little reminder is probably a good thing. All right. Now, so why is my screen frozen up? That didn't happen yesterday. Let's try again. Ah, there we go. Don't know what the problem was, but first of all, a little bit of background. If you're interested in much more detail than this, it can be found in the online course rating manual. But this will just be a little bit of an update, really. Uh, the course rating system developed by the USGA was implemented in its present form or nearly present form in 1987. Uh, and what's new, of course, is that the USGA course rating system, including slope rating, has now been incorporated into the World Handicap System. And there is an international course rating committee, which is a subcommittee of the WHS, which continues to review and develop the system. And Canada has a representative on that committee, Alison Chisholm from New Brunswick, and a member of Golf Canada Board of Directors. And the current chair of the Handicap and Course Rating Committee is Canada's representative on that course rating subcommittee. And you all know this part too. It's designed to ensure a consistent comparison of courses to one another so that players can play against players from other courses, play at other courses, and have a standardized system of recording and keeping their data for handicap purposes. And of course, accuracy and consistency are key. So the first thing is measurement. And in particular, the playing length, then obstacles. And the main difference here is the playing length adjustments or corrections have to do with what happens as you go down the hole. It's things which everybody essentially has to deal with, even those that are hitting good shots, because it might, for example, be a penalty area that extends right across the fairway that everybody has to carry at some point to get to the green. Obstacles, on the other hand, for the most part, not exclusively, but for the most part, obstacles are what we find at the sides of the holes, and are what you run into if you make a poor shot. There are a few exceptions to that, but that's the main. And of these, the length is paramount in determining a course rating. Probably on the order of 95 or more percent of the course rating comes from how long the course plays, in particular, after making adjustments for things that affect the playing length. So in this morning's session, we are going to concentrate on the playing length, what we call the effective playing length, or EPL. And then in tomorrow's session, we will go on to talk about the rating of the obstacles, which we find alongside the hole in most cases, although they have to be crossed in some cases as well. So a little bit about measuring holes, and again, you're all veterans. Number 1 point, scorecard yardage is not acceptable as a sole source of measurement. This is not quite so much of a problem now as it used to be. When this rule came into effect, the first set of course ratings as we went around, we found, and I'm sure course raters everywhere in the world found, very, very large differences from what was on the scorecard to how the hole should have been measured. You might, for example, have seen holes where the permanent marker on the tee area is right at the very back, and so therefore represents a position from which only the very longest way that hole could be played, where what we need is the average way the hole could be played, because of course people don't always have the tees right at the very tips. There's a range. Okay, so speaking of the permanent markers, there would be one. The round white ones ahead would be the daily tee markers, where the staff wants you to play from that particular day. This permanent marker doesn't have to be fancy like this. I know what we put in at my home course, we just found some salvaged bricks and set the bricks down, so that the mower wouldn't hit them, obviously, and just painted the top surface of the bricks with the color of the tee. You don't have to put the yardage on a permanent marker. Okay. The white ones then, those, as I said, were the daily ones. And the idea is that the daily markers should be found behind and in front of the permanent markers in about equal numbers, so that they move back and forth across where the permanent marker is, which represents the average length for that hole. And here's one like I was talking about, where the permanent marker is not in the right place. Should be probably more like there. So measuring holes, well, a straightaway par 3 is measured. They measure to the front and to the back of the green and then take the average. It's also okay if you find the middle of the green and measure to that. And a dog leg, you must follow the route of the fairway in measuring a hole. You don't go cutting straight across, even though in some cases a scratch golfer can cut across part of the corner, and we'll come to that in a few moments. But here again, you would measure to the pivot point or bend point, and then measure either front and back and then average them, or from the bend point to the middle of the green. And similarly, for a 3-shotter, you would go to, if it had 2 bend points, you'd measure to each of them successively and then to the green. Okay, people, staff, do we have any questions? Okay, good. Didn't really expect any on that, because I'm sure you've all seen it before. All right, then we've talked about the hole. Now let's talk about the people playing the hole, the scratch and the bogey golfer. Oh, there's a slide I should have changed. We're not using the term golfer anymore. We're changing that to player. make a little note to change that. I had to go through a whole bunch of things and change golfer to player, change the USGA logo to the World Handicap logo. Anyway, I missed doing it on these. A player who can play to a course handicap of 0 on any and all rated golf course. The male, we assume, for definition purposes, can hit tee shots that average 250 yards and a cumulative total after 2 shots of 470 yards. In other words, he will hit fairway, his maximum fairway woods would average about 220. Now we know that the modern scratch golfer hits the ball farther than this, has for years. So the question is often asked, well, why don't the authorities, i.e. the course rating system, change that to something like 280 or whatever is now the average? Well, the biggest reason for not changing it is that it takes about 10 years to go through a rotation of rating all the golf courses because a rating lasts for 10 years. Well, if you started changing the defined distance for the golfers, you would have the situation that for the next 10 years, you could no longer properly compare one course to another because the ones rated with the longer distance would come out different for their course ratings than the ones using the current 250 yards and the corresponding ones for women and for the bogey golfer. So that's why that change has never been made and probably never will, simply because of the lag time that it would take to get all of the golf courses on the planet back into the same, using the same standards. Okay, on the women's side, we assume that the scratch woman can hit tee shots averaging 210, subsequent shots up to 190. For the bogey, for the male bogey, tee shots averaging 200 yards, subsequent shots of fairway shots of up to 170 yards. And for the female bogey, course handicap of approximately 24 on a course of standard difficulty. Has anybody ever played a course of standard difficulty? That would be one that has a slope of 113. Anyway, she can hit an average of 150 off the tee and subsequent shots of up to 130, considerably less distance than the scratch female. And once again, by the way, I've worked at amateur tournaments with the modern day. The young women hit the ball farther than 210, let me tell you. But again, for the same reason, we can't change that without putting everything out of balance for a 10-year period. Course rating. The World Handicap System's mark indicates the evaluation of the difficulty for the scratch player. 1 decimal point based on effective playing length and other obstacles. Again, this is just a review for all of you here today, but sort of visualize how this would play out in explaining things to rookies as well. And it's only fairly recently that we actually saw what the bogey rating was. It was always there and it was used in the calculation of the slope. but it now has got to the point where we can have it appear on the printed tables and so on, and it's useful to do that. If you aren't doing that in your jurisdiction, I would recommend it, because it's a lot easier to explain things to the bogey player if that individual can see what the bogey rating for their set of tees actually is. Okay. And the slope, essentially the system which allows us to interpret between the course rating and the bogey rating to deal with other golfers of ability somewhere in between. Okay. Based on what's defined in mathematics as the slope of a line, the ratio of the rise over the run. They pointed out here the lowest slope rating is 55 and the highest is 155. And the standard, just arbitrarily really, I guess, was set at 113. Okay, so here looks like the course rating for scratch is 70, and it looks like the bogey rating here is maybe about 96. So the slope here is 140. Now, there's mathematics involved in the units that they use, but here's what it amounts to, is that the player's average score goes up 1.40 strokes for every increment of 1.00 in the handicap index. Oh, let's go back for that for a minute. So a 10, for example, a 10 handicap here, we'd go up here, and that would be the what we would expect a golfer with a 10 handicap index to shoot on average. Landing zones. And that's, of course, where the average shots for each type of golfer would occur on the fairway. Landing zones are the width of the fairway, and they run from where the ball hits the ground to where it rolls out and stops. So in this slide, the red boxes indicate the landing zones for bogey golfers, and the blue ones indicate the landing zones for the scratch players. You'll notice the one up here, because the fairway is narrower up here, this landing zone is not nearly as wide as any of these others, but they are the same length. And we'll see a bit more about that in a moment. Okay. What is assumed here is that on average, full shots, drivers and fairway woods, have 20 yards of roll after the ball hits the ground. So for example here, the male scratch, who we've defined to hit a 250-yard drive on average, that shot will be 230 yards of carry, and then the ball will roll out an additional 20 yards. Again, remember, these are averages. And the same guy's fairway wood that we've assumed goes 220 on average, that would consist of carrying through the air 200, landing and rolling another 20. You can't use the same assumption for short approach shots to the green. We all know from experience that if you're hitting a pitching wedge or a 9-iron or something like that as your approach shot to the green, unless you've practically sculled it, it's not going to roll another 20 yards after it lands. Maybe it'll roll 10. If you put a lot of spin on the ball, it might stop dead or even pull backwards. But it's certainly not going to have a 20-yard rollout for shots of that type. But it's these maximum length shots that we mainly are dealing with here. Just a second here. I'm going to see if I can move this bar to where did. Don't know where. Don't know where it is on this one. It was. I knew where it was on the other view, but well, anyway, we won't worry about that, I guess. So, questions about the ability of the golfers.
Richard,
Yes?
there was a question in the chat. Are players hitting further largely due to equipment improvement?
Partially due to equipment improvement. I would suggest that by far the reason that the really top players are hitting the ball so much farther is that they are now truly athletes, that they are working out for additional strength. They're way fitter than golfers used to be. Again, I'm talking here about the low, scratch golfers and near scratch golfers and plus handicap golfers. Most of them have better technique now. Yes, they're hitting better equipment, but they're also better at hitting. And I suspect that if we put an old persimmon driver in some of their hands, they would be hitting it longer than they would have 20, 30 years ago as well. Okay. The obstacle rating form. Now, again, Saskatchewan people will know this, and I have made presentations in both Alberta and Manitoba where I've used the same obstacle rating form as this. Okay, so here's the form. There's 3 columns of data. This might be used for hole number 1, hole number 2, number 3. Then you'd flip it over. We print them double-sided. 4, 5, 6 would be on the back of this piece of paper, and then you'd go on from there. So throughout the presentation, I'm going to just be using this section because it's adjacent to the column that identifies what each of these rows represent. Okay, something got lost down here on the first one because of this bar. Did that? Oh, I can just drag it. That's good. Trouble is now I'll have to move it around. The first one anyway was going to show down here where you'd put the altitude adjusted shot lengths from the guide. For altitudes above sea level, if we get up around 2,000 feet or more above sea level, shots fly farther due to the thinner air. It's significant enough of a difference that we have different shot lengths, and that they're found in your guide on page 19. Can this thing be tipped? No, I guess not. Anyway, then up at the top, the second one was referring to where we'd record the average rough height based on what the superintendent tells us about how high is the rough cut and how often is it cut, so that we can put something in that represents the average. Have we frozen up again here? What's going on? Appears like we have. No, there we go. Okay. I can't. Okay, something's going weird here. I'm going to stop this and go back and restart it at where we are here. Don't know why this is freezing up on me. Okay, this is where we should have been. It's highlighted the area where we would put in the hole number, the length of the hole, the par, and if we're needing to measure elevation change, we put our altimeter reading in up here. Then down here is where the theoretical distance to the green from each landing zone, if we assume there are no effective playing length adjustment. This is determined strictly by the information in those shot length tables that we were looking at a moment ago. And incidentally, Wayne Bucknell, one of our team leaders in Saskatchewan, came up with a spreadsheet to help us with this. It looks like this. I made some modification to it, but I give Wayne full credit for pioneering this. Slide this up out of the way. This spreadsheet has tabs for up to 5 different tees. And it has the default standard distances here. This comes right out of that shot length table. Here's where you put the hole length. And then over here, it'll give you the end mark of each landing zone. Here, for example, on a longer hole, the scratch landing zone from the tee shot would still be 261 from the green. He would hit 220 and be only 41 left from the green, and so on. Same thing for the bogey men, women scratch, women bogey. Then on each tab, you'd put in the length for that, and you get the same thing. You get all your landing zones. There's for the red. Now, in this particular example, there were only 3 tees that I put in here. But over here, there's a place where you can see the differences between the tees. And remember this when we get to talking tomorrow about how we can rate 2 sets of tees from the same location in some cases. So this would help identify those cases. All right, one thing I don't like about this is how every time you share and unshare, it moves. Okay, let's see. Hopefully this will advance now. Okay, yeah. This thing is a bloody nuisance. Okay, what we had seen here, we'd been down as far as the book distance. Then we have an area here for recording dog leg and forced layup EPL adjustments. And new is the fact that we now put dog leg and forced layup in separately. Used to be we had one entry for dog leg or forced layup. Now it's been split up into two. Then an area in which we can record the EPL table values and adjustments for roll being the additional roll or the loss of roll that you get when your tee shot lands on a downhill or uphill slope, and that changes the distance that it rolls out. And then just under that book distance row, we have the adjusted distance to the green, and that would be the distance to the middle of the green from the end of each landing zone as they are adjusted for roll, dog leg, force, layup, and layup by choice. So these are the ones that we're actually going to use, these ones that are EPL adjusted. Now, it may be that there on many holes there won't be any adjustments, and you wouldn't even write anything in here in that case. But if there are adjustments, this is where you would make them. Frozen again. That's really weird. I can scroll down and back up and get them, but anyway, we'll press on. Area here to record summary table values. This is sort of where the last step actually. So if these had come out in the proper order, this one wouldn't be here yet until we looked at this one down here, which is where we record the obstacle table values and shot specific adjustments for each landing zone, these columns at the green. And what we've done in here is what we go to the book for, the guide, to get to the tables that give us the sort of final values for each category, which go in here. Okay, questions and recording, or on measurements and recording. Okay, effective playing length corrections. Maybe the scroll wheel will work better than using the arrows. All right, so what are the playing length corrections? We've got roll, dog leg forced layup, elevation from tee to green, wind, and down here that you can't see for this thing, altitude above sea level. I'm going to have to see if I can find some way of ditching this thing. I can. Oh, well, that just makes them there all the time. That's worse. Okay. So what is roll? We talked about it already. It's when the tee shot lands on an upslope or downslope and changes the distance that the ball rolls. And it's a little bit counterintuitive. If there's less than normal roll, we get a plus rating for roll. And the reason is that the remaining large yardage is more than it was before. So in other words, the shot to the next shot will be, or the shot to the green will end up being more difficult by being longer because it has not had the normal amount of roll. And our tee shot, again, talking about the scratch male, instead of going 250, maybe it only went 245 because of that. So the next shot, the shot to the green is going to end up being 5 yards longer. Or if the ball rolls farther than normal, we get a minus roll rating since the remaining yardage is decreased. Okay. It takes a little while to get one's head around that. So this is the table that would be used. And this table was changed for this current round. Didn't used to have the extreme down slope or the extreme uphill slope as part of the table. We had an adjustment instead that was applied. Now they have made the table wider and put those extremes in at the two ends. In the field, we typically use 5 yards as an approximate distance that would correspond to each point of roll. It's actually in the math of the course rating system, it's 4 point something, but 5 out in the field is a good enough way of doing this. And with experience, we get to the point where we can look at a sloping landing zone and say, yeah, that's going to lose 5 yards, or that's getting steeper, that's going to lose 10 yards of roll, and then we take that and go back and figure out, well, say, what would that have been on the table here, and that's what we put into the system. Okay, here's some other things about roll rating. Sometimes you'll get a situation where a player, typically the bogey player, cannot carry to the fairway cut and lands instead in cut rough, but thick, which is thick enough to reduce the distance the ball rolls after landing. Okay, some other things here. Only on a par 4 or par 5, or I guess for some women, you might even have for a par 6 hole. For bogey, on par 3 holes that the bogey cannot reach in one shot. In other words, we never use the roll if we're talking about the approach shot, one which is expected to reach the middle of the green. That's dealt with in terms of the topography table. Okay. When the player's hitting a full shot, we can do roll. But if the player is playing less than a full shot, because, for example, in this case, a full tee shot would go too far and go through the end of the fairway and into the trees over here, we wouldn't make any allowance for roll, because the player would take that into consideration in choosing what club to hit. So here's an example. This might mark the normal landing zone. This is assumed to be the 150-yard marker here. So on this hole, the player's tee shot would have landed along somewhere here on this line and bounced and rolled forward 20 yards to where this line is. So what we're saying, though, is that this is uphill, and it's uphill enough that we think that the scratch player is going to lose 10 yards of roll. So therefore, we'll only roll up to this yellow line here, and that will make the shot to the green 10 yards farther than it would have been without being the uphill fairway. Okay, so in approximate terms, that 10 yards that the shot has lost would be equivalent to 2 roll rating points, and that's what we would put in recording on our obstacle form. Okay. We'd put the +2 there. Now we have to also, over here, we had a book distance to the green of 150. We know that because we saw that 150. Why is this thing popped up again? I guess you have to every so often hide it again. Oh, maybe it had to do with, all right, let's get back to where we were supposed to be. Okay, as I was saying, the book distance we know to be 150 because we saw the 150 stake at the end of the theoretical landing zone. But we now know that the shot to the green, the approach shot, is 10 yards longer than it used to be, or that it would be without the roll adjustment. So we have to put in here for the adjusted distance of the green 160. There are some possible adjustments. This used to be given a different title, but they've relabeled it. It achieves the same effect. They now call it soft fairway or firm fairway, F+1 adjustment or F-1. +1 if the fairway is way softer than normal, and F-1 if the fairway is way firmer than normal. I know in the prairies we often will see the firm situation because a lot of the small rural courses don't have the budget to do much irrigation, if any, on their fairways. And therefore the fairways get very dry and firm. Okay. There's also the 2 ways or the 2 adjustment. If a subsequent full shot, in other words, on a long hole, you've got your tee shot and then you've got a full fairway shot that's not going to get to the green, then if that results in less or more cumulative roll than the assumed average 20 yards per shot, we can make the adjustment with a +1 or -1 as the case may be. So if instead of there, it goes to there, Okay, questions about roll?
Hi, Richard. There's some questions in the chat here. For roll, it is average approximately of 5 yards equals plus or -1 for the adjustment.
Yes. Yeah, it's really, if you go into the math of the formulas in the course rating system, the amount that they use for each roll point is 4-point-something yards. But from a practical point of view, it's way easier for us as course raters to just go in 5-yard increments and translate that to a change of 1 point of roll for every 5 yards.
Okay. And then there's another question. How does a rater know whether a fairway is usually soft or firm based on one visit to any particular course?
It's just experience. You'll know when you play it, because playing the course is part of it too. And if it is very firm, for example, you'll notice that your drives go farther, or that they don't go far enough if it's soft. First hole at Golf Canosie comes to mind, because you're shooting from a very high elevation down to a fairway that is always a little bit on the damp side. You definitely get a roll adjustment on that shot, because the ball will sometimes even plug in the fairway because it's coming almost straight down by the time it gets there. So when it's really necessary, with experience, we see where the need is. As I say, in Saskatchewan, for example, far more often you're going to see one where it's maybe firmer than normal. Oh, I see what happens. Anytime somebody gets to the waiting room, that causes this to reappear. Okay. Candace, does that answer your question?
Yeah, and there's a couple more. So it says, if negative roll, do we adjust the landing area distance and measure the obstacles from EPL?
Yes, absolutely. You would, after assessing your roll, your landing zone is then where the adjusted roll would put it. So in the case of this example, the landing zone would be rated at that 160-yard line rather than the original 150. Wherever an EPL adjustment puts the landing zone, that is where you also rate the obstacles.
Okay, and there's another one. On the last slide, what is meant by cumulative?
Oh, well, if you had, let's say you had a long hole that was all downhill all the way, and you had, say, figured that you're going to get 5 yards extra roll on the tee shot, and then that your second shot is also going to get 5 more yards of roll, then the cumulative would be 10 yards of roll. You could also get a situation where it cancels out, where if the hole is sort of in a hollow and you go down and then back up to the green on a long hole, your tee shot might get extra roll going down, but then your second shot might lose some of that roll going back up, and you might end up netting 0 or accumulating 0. So it just means you would add it to whatever you had on the tee shot.
I think that maybe answers a bit of the next one. On a par 5, can adjustments cancel out if the tee shot is uphill and the second shot has a downhill roll? So that
yes, or vice versa. Yes, in either case, that's what the cumulative would do that. Yeah.
Okay, that's all the questions in the chat so far.
Okay, thank you. Okay, now we're going to be talking about both dog leg and force layup. But before we can talk about it, we have to define how we can safely carry an obstacle. And we assume in the course rating system that to safely carry, your shot must land at least 10 yards past the far boundary of the penalty area. So what happens if you can't? Well, in this case, you may have to do a different shot. You may have to, in this particular one here, it looks like since you can't make it across here, that you'd have to go to this bailout area over here, which you can make. So when you're recording those carry distances over an obstacle, you include that 10-yard margin of safety in what you write down. So if the far side of the penalty area was 100 yards, say, from where you're hitting, the carry distance that you'd put in the table, or that you would use to look it up in the table, you'd use 110. You would add that 10-yard margin of safety. Okay. So first, the dog leg. How much longer or shorter a hole plays because it's got a bend in it. Sometimes you'll be able to cut the corner and shorten the hole. Sometimes you'll have to hit less than a full tee shot, and that will essentially lengthen the hole compared to the theoretical straightaway hole. So here's an example. In this particular one, it's an example player cutting the corner. Okay, firstly, the measurement of the hole from the particular tee box we're rating down, that one down there. So measuring in accordance with what we saw earlier, we find that to the bend point or pivot point, it's 217 yards. And from the pivot point to the middle of the green is another 186 yards. So the total measured length, the way we're supposed to measure a golf hole, is 403 yards. Okay, well, let's just pause for a moment. How do we measure this? Well, in the field, you would measure this either with a handheld GPS that has shot length measuring capabilities, or you could measure it by having one of the raters stay here while the other goes out here and looks back with a laser rangefinder, and then somebody stands here, somebody goes to the middle of the green and again use the laser rangefinder. Handheld GPS is much faster, of course. Anyway, so we had here our measured total of 403 yards. If it were flat and straight, the theoretical approach shot for the scratch male golfer would be 153 yards. The total length minus the driver average distance. Okay, so the book distance to the green was 153. Now, here's what the scratch golfer would be most likely to do. He would hit over these bunkers to a point out on the fairway over here. This line here, the first one coming from the tee, this is 250 yards. So, and the safe carry portion of that, to get clear of the bunkers plus 10 more yards here, is about 210 yards. So that's easily within the scratch carry distance, which is, remember, 230 of carry plus 20 of roll. So the scratch male golfer can definitely, on this line of play, safely carry these bunkers and get out into the fairway. So this actual then, once, and again, in terms of what you do in the field, now you get to the point where it's really easier with a GPS than it is with the laser rangefinder, because you might not be able to see from here to here because there's a mounding, or there's a rise in the land here. Whereas with a GPS, as long as you've marked your tee location, your GPS will give you the straight line distance, and you just find what you need out here. And you use the GPS also to get your remaining distance to the middle of the green. Okay, so this measured approach shot length from here to the middle of the green, we find to be 136 yards. Now, incidentally, this is a Google Earth view of a real golf hole. And these measurements have actually been made in addition to using the Google Earth measuring techniques, measuring facility. This was originally done in the field with Gulf Saskatchewan radars and handheld GPS. Some of you will, Saskatchewan people will remember this hole, and you know this hole. Okay, now just a further note here. Why can't he cut off more of the corner? Because there's a stand of big trees right here. So he couldn't angle his shot because it would be back on the down trajectory, and it would be most likely to hit these trees rather than to get out on the fairway on a line more like that. So, okay, I don't remember seeing that red line before.
Sorry, guys, that was my fault. Pardon me, Richard. I'm trying to get your original screen. Like, I can't see anything that you are doing. All I see is your face and Terry and the other participants. I can't get back onto your shared screen.
Well, okay, is anybody else having the same problem?
Oh, it's good for me.
I'll just stop and I'll start the share again. Has that fixed it?
Yes, thank you. It's working good now. Thank you.
Okay. So where were we? Oh, okay. We're going to enter the adjusted distance to the green here, the 136 that we measured. So it was theoretically 153, and the actual adjusted was 136. So the dogleg correction value is the difference between them minus 17. Note, it's always adjusted minus theoretical, which is why this comes out to be a minus number, which it should, because by cutting the corner, he has shortened his approach shot, shortened the effective length of the hole by 17 yards. Okay, here's an example in the other direction. In this one, we're going to see that the golfer must hit a less than full tee shot. This one, again, using our proper measuring technique from the tee in question, it's 170 to the bend point or pivot point, and it also then measures 130 from that point to the center of the green. Measured length of the hole then is 300 yards. Okay, if the male bogey golfer, which is the one we're looking at in this case, were to hit a full tee shot towards the pivot point, his 200-yard shot would go, obviously, potentially 30 yards past the pivot point and would run out of fairway up in here. Now, what about cutting the corner? Well, if we measure this, we find that the distance from the tee, straight line, to the far edge of the bunker is 180. So a safe carry would require 10 more than that, or 190 yards. That wouldn't be any problem for a scratch golfer, but the male bogey only hits a carry of 180 and a roll of 20 to get his 200. So he cannot safely cut this corner. Okay, so what he would do instead is use a less than full shot. He'd probably hit a 3-wood or something like that. Well, would be that if he's the defined bogey golfer, because he hits 3-woods 170. So he would do that. He would hit a 170-yard shot to here, leaving him with an adjusted approach shot of 130. So going back to the chart here, if it were a straight flat hole that was 300 yards long, his approach shot would be 300 minus 200, or 100 yards. We put the adjusted in there, 130, and we see that in this case, the hole is playing 30 yards longer as far as the approach shot go than the theoretical would be. So here the dog leg value is plus 30. He has he's had to play in a way that makes the hole play 30 yards longer than it would if it were just straight and flat. That's the thing to remember in figuring out all of these dog legs. The theoretical, the book stuff, is what would happen if the hole were straight and flat and there were no features to interfere. The adjusted is what we'd have to do either to cut the corner or to hit a shorter tee shot so as not to go out, run out of fairway. Okay. This is new. We used to enter dog leg adjustments, 5-6 yards even. They now want us to only make an adjustment for dog leg if the change in effective playing length is 10 yards or more. Okay, questions about dog legs?
Richard, there's a question in the chat. Why do you need to record book distance and adjusted dog leg distance and then also do the math difference? Is the difference important to the rater?
Oh, absolutely. The distance, remember, the distance that the hole plays is 95 or more percentage of the course rating. These EPL corrections that we're talking about today, quite frankly, are way, way, way more significant to the course rating than the obstacles along the side. So yes, recording all of this and getting the dog leg adjustment in this case, it'll be it was roll in the other case. It will be again recorded under forced layups as we'll see in a moment. Yes, these are vital information. This is vital information.
Thanks, Richard.
Okay, anything? Any others?
It says, is this not a forced layup?
It could certainly be regarded that way, although for some reason the powers that be that developed the system want it to be treated a little bit differently. And I guess the reason the reason they want it treated differently than a forced layup is that golfers in between the abilities, and even some bogey golfers might choose to hit it a little bit differently. I don't know whether I can go back far enough here that we actually see it. Might choose to hit a shot that'll go a little more than 170. They might choose to play on an angle more like this and be able to hit a little bit longer shot. In other words, with the dogleg ones, because there are differences in the way that you do things, it's a little bit different from the forced layup, which we're going to see in a minute or two. But it certainly is the equivalent in terms of however he chooses to deal with it. It is the same. He is laying up in the sense that he's not able to hit a full shot. But when there's when it's caused by a bend in the fairway, they want us to treat it and enter the result in the dogleg portion. Now that they've got the separate portion, didn't used to matter because we put the dogleg correction and the forced layup correction with just one box on the form. But now that it's two, they want us to separate them out.
Richard, for that previous question, there's just a follow-up. I know it's important to the calculation, but why am I doing the math on the course? For example, won't the system take care of this for me?
Well, no, because you have to put the adjusted shot length in, because that's where you go to do the course rating for the next landing zone. For example, on this one right here, we have to know the adjusted shot length is 170, because this is where we have to measure the obstacles to the side, the bunkers, the width of the fairway, and so on. So we have to record those adjusted shot lengths, because that's what tells us where to go and rate the obstacles.
Also, it says agreed, but why record the difference?
Well, if you look at that, imagine that form again, the only things that get entered into the computer are the top ones. The detailed ones never get entered. We need to know them because it tells us where the next landing zone is, but that part never gets entered into the computer. It's only the section up above there that has the final adjusted table values and the EPL adjustments. That's all that the computer sees. It doesn't see the adjusted shot length. It sees the result of it.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, those adjusted shot lengths, that's for us to go find the next landing zone and evaluate the next shot to the green and so on. The computer deals with it by the minus 17 or the plus 30 as the case may be, because that's what gets entered into the computer, not the shot lengths.
Perfect. I don't see any other questions on here now.
Okay, let's get, all right. All right, forced layup. When an obstacle such as deep bunkers or a penalty area crosses the fairway or reduces the fairway width in the normal landing zone to less than 15 yards for men, 13 yards for women. Or it could be actually the landing zone is 0 wide because the penalty area goes right across the whole fairway. Okay, now here, when a golfer is forced to lay up, we assume he or she lays up to a point 10 yards short of the obstacle. So in other words, we want a 10-yard safety margin in our layup too. Very worst thing you ever do on the golf course is if you're laying up short of the river, laying it up into the river. That just is not fun at all, is it? And because they've split these out, they have to point out to us that the maximum total of dogleg and forced layup correction values on any given hole is plus or minus 50 yards. I've never quite understood exactly why that is, but it is. But if it's even if it's more than 50 yards, when we're looking at our adjusted shot for the next or shot to the green and so on, we use the actual distance remaining. So if we had something that we have to use this maximum of 50, but it was actually, say, 60 yards longer, for the shot adjusted, we would use the 60, but what gets entered in the value for dogleg and forced layup has to total plus or minus 50 or less. Okay. Notice, of course, that in some cases, the adjusted distance may require an additional landing zone, which would then reset, if you like, the distance, remaining distance to the green, and you'd have to adjust that. Example. Some of you Saskatchewan people will know where this is. Okay, from the championship tee, this hole measured correctly the way we're supposed to, out to the pivot point, and then it's straight enough the rest of the way we can measure directly to the middle of the green. 506 yards total. So if we looked at the theoretical landing zones, the book distances, in other words, we would have a landing zone for scratch at 506 minus 250, which is 256, and another one, 506 minus the 470, the total of first two shots, 36 yards from the middle of the green. Okay, so those are our book distances. Okay, for the bogey man, the theoretical landing zones would be at 306 and at 136. 506 minus 200 here, 506 minus 370, which is the sum of the bogey man's first two shots from the middle of the green. Okay, and here are those numbers where we would put them. This is what I was talking about earlier. This is the part up here, above this double line here. This is the stuff that gets entered into the computer. This stuff down here and below doesn't. Unless it gets transferred up here somehow, we don't. This is our working area down here. Okay, so if we now look at what happens after two shots, if that scratch golfer hits a 250-yard drive and a 220-yard three-wood, he's hit it into the Wascana Creek. So he will be forced to lay up. Okay, so how do we deal with this in the field? Well, we will have already gone from the tee to the scratch first landing zone here. And we will have done all of the necessary evaluation of obstacles at that landing zone. And then when we're heading off towards the second landing zone, we realize that it's in the water. And we say, well, okay, we got to lay him up 10 yards short of the water. Okay. So he would hit a shot which would finish up here 10 yards short of the penalty area. We now measure his remaining distance to the middle of the green, and we find that it's 82 yards. Now, once again, we would be using the handheld GPS for that. If you don't happen to have GPS, you'd have to have somebody go to the middle of the green and somebody else here and use a laser rangefinder to get the distance. So the difference here, he has laid up by 46 yards. His book value approach shot would have only been 36 yards, but he's now going to have an 82-yard approach shot to the green. So going to the obstacle form again, we have the adjusted distance to the green there. The difference that we talked about, the plus 46, is there. Okay. If it were 56 instead, we could only put 50 here, but we would adjust it down here by the full 56. And a note, we had said that new to this rating series, we don't do dog legs unless it's at least a 10-yard correction. There is no such minimum for forced layup. So if the forced layup is only 5 yards, you enter the 5. You do go ahead and enter the 5 yards. So let's turn our attention to bogey. Excuse me. Bogeyman's theoretical tee shot on that same hole. Now we've obviously zoomed in here. You only see it from the tee to the first little penalty area. So at first glance, it looks like he might carry that penalty area. But no. His tee shot is 180 yards carry, 20 yards roll. The 180 is back. You can see here measuring from the tee. The 380 has not yet reached the penalty area, so the roll would carry him into the penalty area. So if we lay him up again 10 yards short of the penalty area, he would need a 177-yard shot. So he is laid up by 23 yards. Okay, and therefore we must increase the subsequent shots by 23 yards. Here's the chart again. This time we're talking about bogey. These are the ones as adjusted by the 23-yard forced layup. What about layup by choice? Well, if there's some conditions at the landing zone, at the what would normally be the landing zone, that are difficult, then a golfer might choose to hit less than a full shot. This is not forced. So we don't put an entry in the forced layup or the dogleg layup box, but we do adjust the remaining distance to the green for the layup by choice. And there is room on the form to put the layup by choice value, even though it won't be going into the computer. I recommend that the raters do that, simply because if somebody else is looking at their form and wonders why there was an adjustment, or why the adjustment was what it was on the adjusted shots, they can look up and say, oh, I see that they had a layup by choice here. I see why that was done. So it's not necessary, but it is recommended. Okay, a fairway landing zone less than 15 yards without severe obstacles might be a layup by choice. Remember, back before we had a fairway width less than 15 for men or 13 for women with severe obstacles at the side, could be a forced layup. That same fairway width, if the obstacles at the side were not severe, if it was just cut rough, for example, you might choose to to lay up by choice, because you say that's pretty narrow, and my shot from the rough would be awkward. The rough's pretty thick, that kind of thing. You might say, I'm going to lay back by 10 or 15 yards by choice. Okay, so to qualify for a layup by choice, the normal landing zone must present some sort of an unpleasant situation. Could be that you're also laying up by choice to avoid a fairly severe uphill or downhill lie, or to lie back a little farther from an elevated green. Okay, and then if a note, there will be situations, in fact, where the overall amount of layup is a combination of the forced layup and the layup by choice. And here's an example, going back to our scratch man, that second shot that he laid up short of the penalty area. If he just allows the 10 yards of layup, he would be laying up and dropping his ball in the cut rough. If he goes back a little bit further, he can avoid dropping it in the cut rough and can drop it on the fairway. And that additional amount of layup would be a layup by choice. So what's now shown in this slide is that rather than laying up, I think it was 82 yards from the center of the green, he's gone back a little further and is laying up, he's dropping at a point 100 yards from the middle of the green. So now we have to change what we had here. We used to have, what was it? Was it 82 or 84? I can't remember. 82, I think. We now change it to 100, and we put the, just so people looking at this sheet later will know why we've made it 100 with this only being 46. Well, this explains that there was an additional layup of, by choice, of 18 yards to get back out of the rough and be able to drop it on the fairway. Now, again, if this value isn't there, it doesn't affect what happens when the info is entered into the computer, because we don't enter layup by choice. But if somebody else is looking at your obstacle sheet and wondering why this is 82, then this would help. This would explain it. Okay. I got talking before I clicked. I talked a little bit ahead of the slide there. Okay, questions about layups? Okay. Tee to green elevation. How do we measure it? Well, the best way is with an altimeter. You can also, if it's not very much of an elevation change, you can do it with a sighting level. I often use a sighting level where I'm just sort of saying, well, is it that minimum 10 yards up or down that we need to have before we even enter it? And by looking with a sighting level at the height of the flag, you can come up with a pretty good idea whether you're over 10 or not. Trying to do a big change with the sighting level is time consuming. You'd have to, in this case, since it's downhill, you'd have to be down here with a sighting level, get somebody to walk up to where it's level with your eyes, then come there, shoot another level up the hill, another up the hill, another up the hill, adding them together. It's quite used to be quite a painstaking procedure before we started carrying altimeters around. You got to watch altimeters, though. They are dependent on barometric pressure, and particularly in the early morning, they're subject to fluctuation as the heat of the day raises the temperature quickly. That will throw your altimeter off considerably. In the past, when we've been measuring these elevations T to green, and we started rating in the morning, and then we're going out to play in the afternoon, we often will revisit our T to green elevation changes by taking the altimeter with us again. And once you're sort of at the middle of the day where the temperature remains fairly constant for a while, your altimeter readings will be much more accurate. Google Earth will show you elevations or altitudes above sea level when you're looking at things. But for some reason, it isn't all that accurate. I guess maybe it's because the satellites are up, and instead of lateral distance, you're trying to measure vertical distance from a satellite, and that's more complicated. The first hole at Katepwa, if you look at it in Google Earth, we have three tee boxes, and running your cursor in Google Earth over from the back one to the middle one to the forward one, Google Earth tells you that the middle one is lower than the front one. Well, walking down the hill, you just know that that is wrong, because you're going downhill all the way from the back tee box, past the middle tee box, down to the forward tee box. So there are glitches in using Google Earth to measure elevation change. Always, always check them in the field to see whether you've got something reasonable. Now, there's nothing wrong with using Google Earth. It can be a useful tool. It can help you figure out where you can expect to have dog legs and forced layups and so on. It's very good for that, but it's not so good for elevation changes. Okay. So if the elevation T to green difference is 10 feet or more, we will record it. If it's less than 10 feet, even as much as 9 feet, we don't round up to 10. We only use it if it is 10 feet or more. And we round to the nearest 10. So if it's uphill 25 feet, we would round that to plus 30. 14 feet downhill would round back to minus 10 instead of minus 14. We didn't always used to do that. And if you look at what's in the computer files for many of your courses, you will see all kinds of numbers unrounded in the elevation section of the course rating application. As you know, I wouldn't worry about them unless you're re-rating the course. But if you are re-rating the course, I would recommend changing those to round them up or down as required as part of entering the data again for the re-rating. Okay, the maximum for a par 3 is 40 feet up or down. I mean, the hole itself might be 50, but we can only record the maximum of 40. And just a little note here, this is not the same as the approach shot elevation, which we have to measure to do our topography rating when we're doing the obstacle ratings as we go around the course. For par threes, obviously, it will be the same thing since the play of the hole is simply from the tee to the green, and that's it. Okay. On the form, we would have recorded, if we're using an altimeter, when we were on the tee, we would have recorded in here the value from the altimeter. And when we were up at the green, we would record the altimeter's reading at the green. Here, the difference, we've gone from 55 to 28. So this is playing downhill, obviously. The difference is minus 27. We would round that to minus 30. Okay, I mentioned you could use the sighting level. And if it's only going to be to decide whether you're uphill or downhill by 10 feet or more than 10 feet, whether you get enough to make the adjustment at all, that the sighting level is a fast and useful way of doing that. But for more significant changes in elevation, it would certainly be faster to use an altimeter. And a note here, the tee to green elevations may have already been determined by an advanced team prior to the rating, or they may have been determined in a previous rating. And while we don't normally, if we're doing a full re-rate, we don't normally use the data from the previous rating, often you can make an exception for this tee to green elevation, because unless something significant has happened, like they've built new tees, built new greens, or they've had a big slumping of the terrain that has significantly changed the tee to green elevation, it's difficult for that to have changed without there being major construction. So you can, generally speaking, trust the previous tee to green elevations as long as you trust the people who were on the rating team to do that in the first place. Practical point of view, here in Saskatchewan, we've been using the altimeters for over 10 years now. So we don't have any of them, any elevations left that were done by taking a whole number of successive sighting level measurements. We've replaced all of those already. So going forward, we tend to use what we've already got for tee to green elevations. Now, again, check for reasonableness. If you see something, you say, hey, wait a minute, no, I don't agree with that, then by all means, you should measure it and confirm it, or say they must have made a mistake. That's way out of whack, and we will remeasure it and change it. But if it looks reasonable, because these elevation tee to green measurements are tricky, given the air pressure variations and so on, it can be time consuming. Okay, questions on tee to green? Wind. We used to out here, certainly in Saskatchewan, and you may have in the other prairie provinces, and maybe up in BC as well. We used to, because it's difficult to establish a prevailing wind direction, we used to just put a point on every second hole for wind. Well, now we aren't supposed to do that way anymore. We're supposed to do it properly, but it doesn't matter so much identifying the direction of the prevailing wind. We're now using an average daily wind speed at times when golf is played. And that's important because normally we find the wind in daytime tends to be stronger than the wind overnight. And if you just look at a day's worth of wind in the Environment Canada statistics, you can be fooled by that and not get proper recognition of the wind speed. Okay, and a little note here: if a course is generally windy, and you're trying to decide on how to rate a particular obstacle value, and you could go one way or the other. You might want to go to the higher value, recognizing that wind will tend to make everything that we do out there a little more difficult. We do not, however, adjust the shot lengths for wind, because who knows, it probably on a different day going to be even in a different direction, and on the average, you're right by just leaving it alone. Again, as they always say in the disclaimer, your results may vary, but here in southern Saskatchewan, where I'm located, where the wind on the golf course isn't from the southeast, it tends to be from the northwest. We get very little wind from the other, 90 degrees from those. So in particular, changing the shot lengths wouldn't make sense, because the very next day the wind probably in the other direction, and instead of shortening the shot lengths, you'd have to be lengthening again. Okay, if wind is not much of a factor, you wouldn't make an adjustment for wind at all. Where is this likely to be the case? Well, certainly some parts of Saskatchewan aren't as windy as others, and I'm sure the same would be true for the other provinces as well. The courses in southern Saskatchewan do not tend to be as thickly protected by trees as the courses in northern Saskatchewan. Different type of tree as well. The coniferous trees, the spruce, the pine, and so on, do a much better job of sheltering the golfer from the wind until you get the ball up really high anyway. Whereas the deciduous trees that we have in the south, well, the treetops way up there may be waving in the wind, and the wind comes right at us underneath, because all that we've got to block it is the trunk of the tree, and that's not taking up very much space at all. So you have to make value judgments, I guess, both in terms of what you observe and in talking to the golfers and the people in the clubhouse and so on at the course that you are rating at a time, as to how much effect the wind has on play. Okay. Now this is still from the USGA's or the World Handicap System text here, that checking with local authorities. Well, here we don't really have the data kept by the local authorities. It's kept by Environment Canada for all the local authorities. So this is the original table in the guide as they came out of the printer. As you can see here, it's based in miles per hour, and they're going 2 miles per hour in each column. But let's just look over here for the moment. The amount of adjustment can go from 0 all the way up, if you've got more than a 20 mile per hour wind during golf time, 198. And these are actual yards. So what this table is telling us, that for these high sustained wind speeds, it's adding almost 200 yards to the effective playing length overall of that set of tees, or of that golf course. Okay. Now, if we're attempting to do this, we go to the historical weather information from Gulf Canada, and of course, all of our data is expressed and is kept in kilometers per hour. So what I did a few years ago when this wind rating changed was I made a table in kilometers per hour, and I used the tweener concept, or interpreting between data to get a smooth variation, to go in 1 kilometer per hour increments all the way from less than 8, which is the same thing as less than 5, all the way up to greater than 32, which is the metric equivalent of the 24, or the 20, I should say. The range then still goes essentially from 0 yards up to up to 198 yards. So we cover the same range. This one is now expressed to the nearest kilometer. Now, it's not part of this presentation, but we do have available a methodology that can be used to extract this information from the Environment Canada website. We won't spend any time with it here. It's not something that's done in the field. It's something that the team leaders will do as they're getting the data ready to be entered into the computer application. So we just want to be aware that it's there. And as raters in the field, the one thing we should be looking for and providing is the estimate of, okay, we know how windy it is, but how well protected or unprotected is this golf course from the wind? And again, looking at the trees and so on, how big, how important is the wind, whatever the wind turns out to be, how important is it going to be in this situation? And of course, the team leader would jot that down, and it would be used when the data was being entered. Okay, the next one that we have here is altitude above sea level. At courses 2,000 feet or more, correction must be made to the effective playing length due to the thin air. Okay. Adjustment for altitude above sea level is evaluated only on par 4 and par 5 holes where full tee shots are made, and for the male scratch and bogey golfer and the female scratch golfer, not for the bogey woman. The reason is that they tend not to hit the ball high enough in the air for it to be that much affected by how much it carries through the air. Okay. Where is this going to come into effect? Well, when we first started looking at this, we found actually we've got more of Saskatchewan than we first thought, which is at 2,000 feet or more, 610 meters if your data source is in meters. So we've got pretty much all the courses in the southwest portion of Saskatchewan will require these adjusted shot lengths, and there are a few other areas of the province as well. Most of Alberta is probably at sufficient altitude. Much of British Columbia will be, the parts up in the mountains. Obviously, the courses down around Vancouver and so on are getting down there close to sea level, so they wouldn't have to do this. But if you're up in the mountains, this would certainly be a factor. Here for Saskatchewan, we get a visual picture of it. Our 610 meters would be somewhere in this color, somewhere between 5 and 7. So somewhere in this color or higher. So that's all of this part down here. And some of this part here, you got little blips like this. This is the Kenosi area over here. So this is something that we have to be aware of. And you'll remember I showed you that spreadsheet that that Wayne first developed and that I modified. I'm going to go back to it for a moment. And share this again. On the first tab, the first tab here where you had your standard shot length distances, if you put in from the table in your guide the adjusted distances that we're supposed to use for scratch men, bogey men, scratch women, this spreadsheet, there's a hidden column in here that picks the maximum of each of these. So if you've put the longer ones in here, the spreadsheet will choose those longer yardages to use in making these calculations of where the landing zones are, so that again, you don't have to go through the detailed calculation hole by hole by hole. You can get it very, very quickly just by putting the adjusted distances in here. Okay, let's go back to where we were. Oh yeah, they've moved it over here now. So this is where we had our areas. As you can see, imagine this angling up into Alberta. And I don't know whether Manitoba has many, if any, areas that are high enough above sea level for this to be a factor, but certainly Alberta and BC will. Okay. You can do this by going to this website, which allows you to zoom in on the topographic maps of Canada, or you can use Google Earth for this. And it's actually Google Earth Pro now. There is no plain old Google Earth anymore. It's all the Pro version, and it's still free, fortunately. When I'd said that what Google Earth had given me was some quirky values for altitude, that's true. But if you take Google Earth and look at various places around the golf course, and look down in the bottom right corner where it gives you those altitudes, you'll get a pretty good idea of whether you're at or above 9,000 feet and what row of the adjusted shot length table you should be using to generate your book distances. So this is the high altitude shot length table. If, for example, you were rating a course that closest to 2,500 feet than to 2,000 or 3,000, these are the values that you would use. These are the values that you could enter into that spreadsheet. And incidentally, those of you from the other provinces, we will gladly make that spreadsheet available to you if you want to use it. It's a very handy tool. Okay, questions about wind and altitude?
Richard, there's a couple questions in the chat. With the changes to World Handicap System allowing adjustments for weather, would that have any factor to the calculation?
Not really. By using the wind adjustment that we were talking about here, that establishes the norm for a Why is that bumped forward on me? Where was I? Okay. Because we are entering that wind data, the normal conditions will already have been applied. So for somebody to say, well, boy, it's really windy here when they're playing in southern Saskatchewan, well, yeah, it's always pretty windy here. So the playing condition correction in the World Handicap system only would come in if the shots scored by the southern Saskatchewan golfers were way higher than normal, which would indicate that the conditions were even worse than normal. In other words, that the wind was really high. So those same PCC might occur when it's, by Saskatchewan standards, not very windy at all, but it's in some place, maybe in Ontario, which doesn't get near as much wind in the first place. So the PCC is there to adjust daily differences from normal, whereas the wind that we put in sort of sets the baseline where it needs to be for the location you're playing in. Does that help?
Yeah. There's one more question. The wind table seems to assume that wind always increases yardage. Can there be a situation where wind actually decreases yardage because of the direction of the wind?
Oh, well, on a given hole, certainly. But overall, the wind reduces your shot lengths. It used to be with the old one, if you had the data, you could assign values that were plus and minus for holes that were upwind or downwind. But as I said, we don't really know in most cases what the direction of the wind on a given day is going to be. So while it's on any given day, if it's windy, some of your shots will be helped by the wind and some of them will be hurt by the wind. The thing is that if you talk about, people in golf often talk about, well, that's a 1-club wind or a 2-club wind. The thing is that the downwind effect of wind on a golf ball is only half as great as it is on a shot into the wind. So overall, the wind is going to make the course play longer, even though on some holes, it might make that hole play a little shorter. But overall, because of the importance of the wind, because of the physics of it, wind resistance varies as the square of speed. So when you're going into the wind, the speed differential is much higher, and when you square that to get the physics effect on the golf ball, that's much more significant than a helping wind, where the relative velocity between the wind and the golf ball is less because they're going in the same direction. They're a little bit of physics lesson in that particular one. And again, in practice, you probably will have noticed that a helping wind doesn't help as much as a hurting wind hurts. So that's just something we also just experience in the golf course. Were there any other questions?
I don't see any more on the chat.
Okay. Okay, we've got to actually to the break point between the two sections. Accuracy tables here have to do with how we rate the obstacles along the side, and that's really what's set for tomorrow's session. So I'm going to stop the share, and we can maybe have, in the time remaining, if you want to ask any sort of questions about particularly the effective playing length corrections to the rating, and if not, you get to go for lunch early. In setting the time, of these sessions, allowing for 4 hours, I tried to be fairly conservative in thinking of how much time was going to be required, i.e., to err on the side of preparing you to stay longer than it might take. And I think maybe tomorrow's might come closer to the full 4 hours, but we'll see. But anyway, if anybody has any question, we don't need to worry about typing them in right now. You can just momentarily unmute your audio if you want to ask a question. Well, hearing none, maybe we're done for the day. Okay, I guess that's it. As I say, tomorrow, well, I know what we could do if we wanted. Well, no, tomorrow's tomorrow. We could have skipped to an end session, but I think it'll work out. It'll work out well for the timing. But so if you have a tea time booked for this afternoon, you'll have plenty of time to get there. Okay. Oh, question here. The copy of the course rating form. Yeah, we can certainly make that available. It's a spreadsheet that can be obviously can be printed in a color printer. Don't use inkjet, because then if you get your papers wet, the ink will run. But what we do in Saskatchewan is we have that commercially printed, and it's laser printed rather than inkjet printed or whatever. I mean, it might be ink, but it's waterproof ink the way the printers do it. We can certainly make that available. I'll work out the details with Brian on how we want to handle that, who we should send them to who you should request them from, and but definitely you're welcome to have the use of the data forms. Welcome to have copies of the spreadsheet for doing the landing zone calculations, and there might even after tomorrow be one or two other things that you want from us too that we're glad to share.